Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most challenging chapters. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey across the treacherous waters of time to explore one of humanity's most enduring struggles, life aboard ancient ships. For thousands of years, brave souls ventured into the unknown depths of our world's oceans, facing conditions so harsh and unforgiving that modern travelers would find them absolutely unthinkable. From the cramped quarters of Roman galleys to the disease-ridden holds of medieval merchant vessels, from the bone-chilling dampness of Viking longships to the suffocating heat of ancient Egyptian barges, we'll uncover the daily realities that sailors faced when the only thing between them and the endless sea was a wooden hull and sheer determination. We'll explore how these maritime pioneers dealt with spoiled food, contaminated water, rampant disease, and the constant threat of storms that could send their vessels to the bottom of the ocean in minutes. This isn't just a tale of hardship. It's a testament to human resilience and the incredible lengths people will go to explore, trade, and survive on the high seas. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The story of horrible conditions on ancient ships begins long before the age of exploration that most people think of when they imagine maritime adventures. We're talking about an era when the very concept of sailing across open water was considered either madness or divine inspiration, depending on who you asked. The earliest seafaring vessels, dating back to around 4000 BCE, were simple reed boats and dugout canoes that hugged coastlines, never venturing far from the safety of land. These primitive craft offered virtually no protection from the elements, and sailors had to endure whatever nature threw at them with nothing more than animal skins and basic shelters made from whatever materials they could carry. The construction of these earliest vessels was itself a testament to human desperation and ingenuity. Reed boats, primarily used by ancient Mesopotamian civilizations along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, were constructed by bundling together thousands of papyrus reeds and binding them with rope made from plant fibers. The process was labor-intensive and required constant maintenance, as the reeds would absorb water and begin to rot within weeks of construction. Sailors on these vessels had to carry extra bundles of reeds and rope to make repairs during their journeys, adding weight and taking up precious space that could have been used for supplies or trade goods. The dugout canoes used by coastal peoples around the world were slightly more durable, but presented their own unique challenges for anyone brave enough to venture out onto open water in them. These vessels were created by hollowing out large tree trunks using fire and primitive tools, a process that could take months to complete and required enormous skill to create a hull that was both lightweight and watertight. The finished canoes were extremely narrow and unstable, requiring constant attention from their occupants to prevent capsizing in even moderate waves. The wooden hulls conducted cold from the water directly to the bodies of anyone sitting in them, causing hypothermia and numbness that made it difficult to paddle or perform other necessary tasks. Early sailors on these primitive vessels faced challenges that went far beyond simple discomfort. The lack of any kind of navigation instruments meant that they had to rely entirely on their knowledge of coastal landmarks, wind patterns, and the behavior of seabirds to find their way from one destination to another. Getting lost was a constant danger that could mean certain death for crews who ventured too far from familiar waters. The primitive construction of these early boats meant that they were constantly taking on water through small leaks and gaps between the materials used to build them, requiring crew members to spend much of their time bailing water instead of focusing on navigation or other important tasks. Food storage on these early vessels was virtually impossible, as there were no watertight compartments or containers to protect provisions from the constant moisture that pervaded every part of the boat. Sailors had to eat whatever they could catch from the water or gather from coastal areas during brief stops on land. Fish that were caught had to be eaten immediately, or they would spoil in the warm, humid conditions. And fresh water was limited to whatever could be carried in basic containers made from animal skins or hollowed-out gourds that were prone to leaking and contamination. The physical demands of operating these primitive vessels were enormous, requiring crew members to paddle for hours at a time in cramped positions that caused severe muscle strain and joint pain. The repetitive motion of paddling led to blisters and calluses on the hands and arms, and the constant exposure to salt water caused skin irritation and infections that could become serious problems when there was no access to fresh water for cleaning wounds. The combination of physical exertion, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to the elements left many early sailors in a state of chronic exhaustion that made them more susceptible to accidents and poor judgment that could endanger the entire crew. The earliest forms of maritime trade were conducted using these primitive vessels, with merchants and traders risking their lives to transport goods between coastal settlements that were separated by dangerous stretches of open water. The profits from successful trading voyages had to be enormous to justify the risks involved, as the mortality rate among early sailors was staggering by modern standards. Entire crews would disappear without trace, swallowed by storms or lost in fog banks that could disorient navigators and send them sailing into oblivion. The seasonal nature of early maritime trade was dictated by weather patterns and the limitations of primitive vessels that could not withstand the storms and rough seas that characterized certain times of year. Sailors had to carefully time their departures to take advantage of favorable winds and calm seas. But even the best planning could not guarantee safe passage when dealing with the unpredictable nature of ocean weather. The short sailing seasons meant that crews had to accomplish their trading objectives quickly, often pushing themselves and their vessels beyond safe limits to complete their missions before weather conditions deteriorated. The cargo carried aboard these early vessels was typically limited to high-value items that could justify the enormous risks and costs associated with primitive sea travel. Precious metals, rare stones, exotic spices, and luxury textiles were among the few commodities valuable enough to make dangerous sea voyages profitable. The limited cargo capacity of early vessels meant that every pound of space had to be used efficiently, leaving even less room for crew comfort and supplies than would be available on later, larger ships. The loading and unloading procedures for these primitive vessels were dangerous and time-intensive operations that exposed crews to additional risks during their brief stays in foreign ports. The shallow draft design that allowed these boats to approach beaches and riverbanks also made them vulnerable to damage from rocks, coral, and other underwater obstacles. Crews had to carefully survey each landing site before attempting to bring their vessels ashore, and even minor miscalculations could result in hull damage that might prove fatal during the return voyage. The social structure aboard these early vessels was necessarily egalitarian, as the small crews could not afford the luxury of rigid hierarchies when everyone's survival depended on the ability to work together effectively under the most challenging conditions. However, this equality came at the cost of specialized knowledge and skills, as crew members had to be capable of performing multiple roles, including navigation, sailing, trading, and defense against pirates or hostile locals encountered during their journeys. The weapons carried aboard these primitive vessels were limited by weight and space constraints, typically consisting of simple spears, knives, and bows that were more suitable for hunting and fishing than for defending against organized attacks by pirates or hostile communities. The vulnerability of early maritime traders made them attractive targets for coastal raiders who could easily overpower small crews and steal valuable cargo without facing significant resistance. The communication systems used by early sailors were extremely primitive, consisting mainly of smoke signals, flag displays, and other visual methods that were useless in poor weather or at night. The inability to communicate effectively with other vessels or coastal communities meant that sailors often had no way to call for help when they encountered problems, and no way to warn others about dangers they had discovered during their voyages. The record-keeping practices of early maritime cultures were minimal or non-existent, meaning that valuable knowledge about navigation routes, weather patterns, and trading opportunities was often lost when experienced sailors died or disappeared at sea. The lack of written records also meant that the same mistakes were repeated generation after generation, as new sailors had no way to learn from the experiences of their predecessors except through oral traditions that were often incomplete or inaccurate. The impact of early maritime trade on coastal communities was profound, as the introduction of exotic goods and foreign ideas began to transform isolated settlements into interconnected networks of commerce and cultural exchange. However, the irregular and unpredictable nature of early sea travel meant that communities could never rely on maritime trade for essential goods and had to maintain self-sufficient economies that could survive extended periods without contact with the outside world. As civilizations developed and trade became more important, ships grew larger and more complex, but the conditions aboard them remained absolutely dreadful by modern standards. The ancient Egyptians, who were among the first to develop sophisticated sailing vessels around 3100 BCE, created boats that could carry substantial cargo and crews along the Nile River and eventually into the Mediterranean Sea. However, these early ships were essentially floating platforms with minimal consideration for human comfort or health. The crew slept wherever they could find space, often directly on the deck under the open sky, exposed to rain, wind, and the scorching desert sun that reflected mercilessly off the water. The construction techniques used by ancient Egyptian shipbuilders, while innovative for their time, created vessels that were uncomfortable and dangerous for their crews. Egyptian ships were built using a technique called shell-first construction, where the hull planks were assembled first and then reinforced with internal frames. This method created vessels that were flexible enough to handle the stresses of river and coastal navigation, but it also meant that the ships were constantly flexing and moving in ways that created gaps between planks that allowed water to seep in continuously. Crew members had to spend significant portions of their time bailing water and stuffing gaps with whatever materials they could find, including cloth, rope, and even food when nothing else was available. The rigging systems on Egyptian vessels were primitive by later standards, consisting mainly of a single square sail made from linen that could only be used effectively when the wind was blowing from behind the ship. When the wind was unfavorable or absent entirely, crews had to resort to rowing, using long oars that required multiple men to operate effectively. The rowing positions on these ships were uncomfortable and poorly designed, forcing oarsmen to work in cramped conditions where they could barely move without interfering with their fellow crew members. The physical strain of rowing these heavy vessels for hours at a time caused permanent damage to the backs and shoulders of many sailors, leaving them crippled and unable to perform other types of work later in their lives. The holds of these ancient Egyptian vessels were primarily designed for cargo, not people, which meant that sailors had to make do with whatever cramped spaces remained after the valuable goods were loaded. Fresh water was stored in clay jars that were prone to cracking and contamination, and food supplies consisted mainly of dried fish, bread that quickly became moldy in the humid conditions, and whatever fruits and vegetables could be preserved for the journey. The lack of refrigeration meant that any fresh provisions spoiled within days, leaving crews to subsist on increasingly questionable rations that often harbored dangerous bacteria and parasites. The bread carried on Egyptian vessels was particularly problematic, as it was baked before departure and had to last for the entire duration of the voyage without any means of preservation. Within days of leaving port, the bread would begin to develop mold and attract insects, but hungry sailors had no choice but to continue eating it or face starvation. The mold that grew on the bread contained toxins that could cause hallucinations, stomach problems, and other serious health issues. But Egyptian crews had no understanding of these dangers and simply accepted the sickness that resulted from eating contaminated food as an inevitable part of sea travel. The fishing practices aboard Egyptian vessels were primitive and often dangerous, as crew members had to lean far over the sides of the ship to cast nets or use hooks and lines to catch fish. Many sailors fell overboard while attempting to fish, and those who couldn't swim had little chance of survival in the swift currents of the Nile or the unpredictable waters of the Mediterranean. Even successful fishing expeditions created new problems, as there was no effective way to preserve the catch for more than a day or two, meaning that crews often alternated between periods of relative abundance and near starvation, depending on their luck with fishing. Personal hygiene was virtually impossible on these early vessels. There were no designated areas for bathing or waste disposal, which meant that sailors had to relieve themselves over the side of the ship, a practice that was not only uncomfortable but also dangerous in rough seas. The combination of poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close quarters created perfect conditions for the spread of diseases that could wipe out entire crews within weeks of departure. Dysentery, typhoid, and various skin infections were constant companions on these maritime journeys, and medical knowledge was so limited that even minor injuries could become life-threatening complications. The medical practices available to Egyptian sailors were based primarily on superstition and religious beliefs rather than any understanding of anatomy or disease. Ship's healers relied on incantations, amulets, and herbal remedies that were often more harmful than helpful. Wounds were treated with poultices made from mud and plant materials that frequently introduced more bacteria and foreign matter into injuries, leading to infections that could spread throughout the body. The lack of any understanding of antiseptic practices meant that even minor cuts could develop into serious problems that could disable or kill otherwise healthy crew members. The Egyptian understanding of disease was heavily influenced by religious beliefs that attributed illness to divine punishment or supernatural causes, leading to treatments that focused on appeasing the gods rather than addressing the physical causes of medical problems. Sailors who became sick were often subjected to elaborate purification rituals that consumed time and resources while doing nothing to address their underlying health issues. The belief that certain illnesses were caused by evil spirits led to treatments involving exorcism and spiritual cleansing that could be traumatic and harmful to already weakened patients. The surgical instruments used by Egyptian ship healers were primitive tools that served multiple purposes beyond medical treatment, including food preparation, rope work, and general maintenance tasks. The lack of specialized medical equipment meant that surgical procedures were often performed using whatever sharp objects were available, including kitchen knives, fishing hooks, and woodworking tools that were never designed for use on human bodies. The absence of any concept of sterile technique meant that these improvised surgical instruments were rarely cleaned before use, creating ideal conditions for infections that could prove more dangerous than the original injuries being treated. The pharmacological knowledge available to Egyptian sailors was based on traditional plant-based remedies that were often ineffective or harmful when used inappropriately. Many of the medicinal plants that were effective in terrestrial settings became useless or dangerous when subjected to the damp, salty conditions aboard ships, where they would quickly deteriorate or develop toxic compounds. The limited understanding of proper dosages meant that sailors were often given either ineffective amounts of medicines or dangerous overdoses that could cause additional health problems. The quarantine procedures used aboard Egyptian vessels were primitive and often counterproductive, typically involving the isolation of sick crew members in the worst parts of the ship, where they would be exposed to additional health hazards. The lack of understanding about how diseases spread meant that quarantine measures were often applied incorrectly, sometimes spreading infections rather than containing them. The limited space aboard ships made effective quarantine nearly impossible, as sick and healthy crew members had to share the same air, water, and food supplies regardless of their medical condition. The dental care available to Egyptian sailors was virtually non-existent, leading to widespread tooth decay, gum disease, and other oral health problems that could become serious medical issues during long voyages. The diet of preserved foods high in salt and sugar created ideal conditions for dental problems, while the lack of any means for cleaning teeth or treating dental pain meant that crew members often suffered from chronic oral health issues that affected their ability to eat and work effectively. The mental health challenges faced by Egyptian sailors were largely unrecognized and untreated, as the concept of psychological medicine was unknown to ancient cultures. Sailors who developed what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were typically viewed as weak or cursed, leading to social isolation and additional psychological stress. The lack of any understanding of mental health meant that crews had no effective ways to cope with the psychological trauma of witnessing death, violence, and suffering during their voyages. The religious obligations imposed on Egyptian sailors created additional stress and consumed resources that could have been used for practical purposes. Crews were expected to perform daily rituals and prayers to ensure the favor of various gods and goddesses, and failure to observe these religious requirements was believed to bring divine punishment upon the entire ship. The time and energy devoted to religious activities competed with the practical needs of ship operation and maintenance, creating conflicts between spiritual and physical survival needs. The Egyptian practice of mummification and elaborate burial rituals created unique challenges when crew members died during voyages, as the religious requirements for proper treatment of the dead conflicted with the practical needs of maintaining ship sanitation and morale. Bodies that could not be properly preserved according to religious law were believed to be condemned to spiritual torment, creating additional psychological stress for surviving crew members who feared for their own souls if they died at sea. The social stratification that characterized Egyptian society extended to their ships, where rigid class distinctions determined everything from sleeping arrangements to food allocation. Higher-ranking crew members received better accommodations and food, while common sailors were relegated to the worst conditions and given the most dangerous duties. This inequality created resentment and tension that could undermine crew cooperation and effectiveness during critical situations. The legal system governing Egyptian ships gave captains and ship owners almost unlimited authority over their crews, with little recourse available to sailors who were mistreated or abused during their voyages. The economic dependence of crew members on their maritime employment made it difficult for them to seek justice or compensation for injuries and mistreatment, creating a system where exploitation was common and largely unpunished. The training provided to Egyptian sailors was minimal and focused primarily on basic tasks rather than comprehensive seamanship skills. New crew members were expected to learn through observation and trial and error, leading to preventable accidents and mistakes that could endanger the entire ship. The lack of standardized training procedures meant that the quality of seamanship varied widely between different crews and vessels, creating additional risks for maritime commerce and exploration. The seasonal nature of Egyptian maritime activity was dictated by the flooding patterns of the Nile River and the monsoon cycles that affected Mediterranean weather. Ships had to be carefully scheduled to take advantage of favorable conditions, but the unpredictable nature of weather patterns meant that voyages were often delayed or canceled, creating economic hardship for crew members who depended on regular employment for their survival. The ancient Greeks, despite their reputation for innovation and civilization, faced similar challenges when they took to the seas. Greek triremes, the warships that dominated Mediterranean naval warfare from the 7th century BCE, were marvels of engineering designed for speed and maneuverability, but they were absolutely miserable places for human beings to live and work. These vessels were essentially giant rowing machines, powered by up to 170 oarsmen who were crammed into tight quarters below deck in conditions that can only be described as hellish. The design of Greek triremes prioritized military effectiveness over crew comfort, creating vessels that were floating torture chambers for the men who powered them. The ship's hull was divided into 3 levels of rowing benches, with the oarsmen arranged in a complex configuration that maximized the number of oars that could be deployed, while keeping the ship's beam narrow enough for speed and maneuverability. The spacing between these benches was so tight that oarsmen could barely move without bumping into their neighbors, and the angle of the oars required the rowers to maintain awkward and physically demanding positions throughout their shifts. The oarsmen on Greek triremes sat on hard wooden benches for hours at a time, their bodies synchronized in an endless rhythm of pulling and releasing that left them exhausted and covered in sweat, despite the constant spray of seawater that soaked through every opening in the hull. The air below deck was thick and stifling, filled with the smell of human bodies, tar, and bilge water that sloshed around their feet. Ventilation was minimal, consisting of a few small openings that were often sealed during storms, leaving the crew to breathe increasingly foul air that could cause dizziness and respiratory problems. The physical demands of rowing a trireme were so extreme that most oarsmen could only work in shifts of 30 to 60 minutes before they needed to be relieved by fresh crew members. During battle conditions, when the ship needed maximum speed and maneuverability, oarsmen were expected to maintain their rhythm for much longer periods, often to the point of collapse. The repetitive strain of rowing caused permanent damage to the shoulders, backs, and arms of career oarsmen, many of whom developed arthritis and other chronic conditions that left them disabled in their later years. The hierarchical structure aboard Greek triremes created additional hardships for the common oarsmen, who were often recruited from the poorest segments of society and treated as expendable human machinery by their officers. The pay for oarsmen was minimal, barely enough to support a family during peacetime, and the dangerous nature of naval warfare meant that many rowers never lived long enough to collect their full wages. The social stigma attached to serving as an oarsman was so strong that many men preferred other forms of military service, even when those alternatives were more dangerous or less well paid. The water supply aboard triremes was strictly rationed, with oarsmen receiving only small amounts of drinking water during their shifts to prevent them from becoming too heavy or sluggish to perform their duties effectively. During long voyages or extended battles, this rationing could become severe enough to cause dehydration and heat exhaustion among crew members who were already pushed to their physical limits by the demands of rowing. The wine that was mixed with the water was often of poor quality and contained sediments and impurities that could cause stomach problems and diarrhea, further weakening the crew's ability to perform their duties. Food on Greek vessels was typically limited to barley cakes, cheese, olives, and wine mixed with water. a diet that provided basic calories but lacked the vitamins and nutrients necessary for long-term health. Sailors on extended voyages frequently developed scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that caused their teeth to fall out, their gums to bleed, and their bodies to become weak and susceptible to other illnesses. The Greeks had no understanding of nutritional science, so they attributed these symptoms to various supernatural causes, or simply accepted them as inevitable consequences of life at sea. The barley cakes that formed the staple food for Greek sailors were hard, dry biscuits that were difficult to chew and digest, especially when they became stale or infested with insects during long voyages. These biscuits had to be soaked in water or wine before eating, but the liquid used for soaking was often contaminated with bacteria or other harmful substances that could cause food poisoning. The cheese carried on Greek ships was preserved with salt, making it extremely salty and difficult to eat in large quantities, while the olives were often rancid from exposure to heat and moisture during storage. The olive oil that was carried aboard Greek vessels served multiple purposes beyond food preparation, being used for lamp fuel, waterproofing, and even as a primitive form of medicine for treating wounds and skin conditions. However, the quality of this oil was often poor, and it would become rancid and foul-smelling within weeks of departure, creating another source of unpleasant odors that added to the miserable conditions below deck. The containers used to store olive oil were made from clay or leather, both of which were prone to leaking and contamination, leading to waste and spoilage that reduced the ship's supply of this valuable commodity. The psychological toll of ancient maritime travel was just as severe as the physical hardships. Sailors spent weeks or even months confined to small wooden spaces with the same group of people, with no privacy and very little entertainment. Tempers flared easily in these conditions, leading to fights and conflicts that could escalate into serious problems when there was nowhere to escape from antagonistic crew members. The constant stress of not knowing when or if they would reach their destination, combined with the very real possibility of being lost at sea forever, created a mental burden that many sailors struggled to bear. The Greek concept of fate and the will of the gods added another layer of psychological stress to maritime travel, as sailors believed that their survival depended entirely on maintaining the favor of Poseidon and other sea deities. This belief led to elaborate rituals and sacrifices that had to be performed before departure and during the voyage, consuming time and resources that could have been used for more practical preparations. The fear of offending the gods through improper behavior or inadequate offerings created constant anxiety among crew members, who were never sure if their next action might bring divine punishment upon the entire ship. The lack of accurate maps or navigation instruments meant that Greek sailors had to rely on their memory of coastal landmarks, the position of stars, and local knowledge passed down through generations of seafaring families. This dependence on traditional knowledge created problems when vessels were blown off course by storms, or when crews attempted to explore new areas where their existing knowledge was useless. The fear of becoming lost was so strong that many Greek sailors preferred to stay within sight of land whenever possible, even when this meant taking longer routes that exposed them to different types of dangers. The Greek concept of hubris, or excessive pride that angered the gods, created additional psychological pressure for sailors who had to balance confidence and skill with proper humility and respect for divine authority. Sailors who appeared too confident or successful were believed to be inviting divine punishment, while those who showed too much fear or doubt were considered unworthy of divine protection. This cultural paradox created constant anxiety about finding the proper balance between confidence and humility in their daily actions and decisions. The Greek trading practices required sailors to serve as both crew members and merchants, creating additional responsibilities and stress for individuals who were already dealing with the challenging demands of operating ancient vessels. Sailors had to understand not only seamanship and navigation, but also the complex economic and political factors that affected trade relationships between different ports and communities. The need to negotiate prices, assess the quality of goods, and understand local customs and languages created intellectual demands that went far beyond the physical challenges of sea travel. The Greek practice of carrying live animals aboard their ships for food and sacrifice created additional problems for crews who were already dealing with limited space and resources. Sheep, goats, and other livestock required food, water, and care that competed with human needs, while their waste products created additional sanitation problems in the confined spaces aboard ship. The animals also represented valuable cargo that had to be protected from theft, disease, and accident, creating additional responsibilities for crew members who were already overworked and stressed. The Greek military system required many sailors to serve dual roles as both maritime workers and soldiers, creating conflicts between the skills and mindset needed for successful seamanship versus those required for effective combat. The weapons and armor carried by military crews took up valuable space and added weight that affected ship performance, while the aggressive mentality encouraged in warriors could interfere with the careful judgment and cooperation needed for safe navigation and ship operation. The Greek philosophical tradition that valued intellectual inquiry and debate created unique cultural tensions aboard ships, where practical survival needs often conflicted with abstract principles and ideals. Educated crew members might spend time discussing philosophical questions when they should have been focused on practical tasks, while the egalitarian ideals promoted by some Greek thinkers conflicted with the hierarchical authority structure necessary for effective ship operation. The Greek religious festivals and obligations required sailors to observe numerous holy days and rituals that could interfere with voyage schedules and practical ship operations. Crews were expected to participate in elaborate ceremonies and sacrifices that consumed time and resources, while failure to observe religious requirements was believed to bring divine punishment upon the entire crew. The calendar of religious obligations was complex and sometimes conflicting, creating confusion and stress for sailors who were trying to balance spiritual duties with practical needs. The Greek practice of slavery meant that many ships carried enslaved crew members who worked under different conditions and motivations than free sailors. The presence of enslaved workers created additional security concerns and management challenges, while the moral contradictions of the slavery system created psychological stress for crews who had to reconcile their treatment of enslaved people with their own values and beliefs. The Greek competitive culture encouraged rivalry and competition between different crews and vessels, leading to dangerous practices, as captains and sailors took unnecessary risks to prove their superiority over their peers. Racing between ships, attempting dangerous maneuvers to impress observers, and taking on challenging voyages beyond their capabilities were common practices that increased the risks faced by Greek maritime crews. The Greek tradition of storytelling and oral history created pressure for sailors to return from their voyages with exciting tales and adventures that would enhance their reputations and social standing. This cultural expectation encouraged risk-taking behavior and embellishment of stories that could mislead other sailors about the true dangers and challenges of maritime travel. The Greek understanding of geography and oceanography was limited and often inaccurate, based on mythological explanations and incomplete observations rather than systematic study and measurement. Sailors operating with incorrect information about currents, weather patterns, and geographic features faced additional dangers from navigating based on false assumptions about the physical world. The Greek economic system created boom and bust cycles in maritime trade that left sailors vulnerable to unemployment and economic hardship during periods of reduced commercial activity. The feast or famine nature of maritime employment meant that crew members often had to accept dangerous or poorly paid positions during economic downturns, increasing their exposure to the worst conditions and most exploitative employers. The Greek political system, with its complex alliances and frequent warfare between city-states, created additional dangers for merchant sailors who might find themselves caught in conflicts between their home ports and their destinations. Neutral merchant vessels were often targeted by warring factions, while crew members could be imprisoned or enslaved if they were captured in territories controlled by hostile powers. The Greek medical understanding, while more advanced than that of some earlier cultures, was still based on incorrect theories about the causes of disease and the functioning of the human body. The theory of the four humors led to treatments that often made patients worse rather than better, while the limited surgical knowledge available meant that serious injuries were often fatal, even when they might have been treatable with better medical understanding. Roman ships, while more advanced than their predecessors in some ways, presented their own unique set of horrors for anyone unfortunate enough to spend extended time aboard them. Roman merchant vessels, known as corbita, could be massive by ancient standards, some measuring over 180 feet in length and capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo. However, size did not translate to comfort, and these ships were notoriously overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Passengers and crew were often packed into spaces so tight that it was impossible to lie down properly, forcing people to sleep sitting up or curled into uncomfortable positions that left them sore and exhausted. The Roman Empire's vast trade network required ships capable of carrying enormous quantities of grain, olive oil, wine, and other commodities across the Mediterranean, leading to the development of vessels that prioritized cargo capacity over every other consideration. The largest of these ships, such as the grain carriers that supplied Rome with wheat from Egypt, were floating warehouses that could transport over 1,200 tons of cargo in a single voyage. However, the human cost of operating these massive vessels was enormous, as crews had to work in conditions that were barely adequate for survival, let alone comfort or health. The construction of Roman merchant ships involved techniques that were advanced for their time, but still created vessels that were uncomfortable and dangerous for their occupants. Roman shipbuilders used a frame-first construction method, building the internal skeleton of the ship first and then attaching the hull planks to this framework. While this technique created stronger and more durable vessels than earlier construction methods, it also resulted in ships with limited flexibility that were prone to catastrophic structural failures when subjected to the extreme stresses of ocean storms. The Roman approach to shipbuilding prioritized cargo capacity over human welfare, which meant that fresh air circulation was severely limited. The lower decks of these vessels were dark, damp, and filled with stagnant air that reeked of bilge water, rotting food, and human waste. Seasickness was endemic among passengers and crew, and the lack of proper sanitation facilities meant that the smell of vomit was a constant presence that made the nausea even worse for everyone aboard. The Romans did attempt to address some of these issues by including small shrines to Neptune and other sea gods on their ships, but divine intervention proved to be an inadequate substitute for proper ventilation and sanitation systems. The bilge systems on Roman ships were primitive and often inadequate for dealing with the constant influx of water that seeped through the hull planks and collected in the bottom of the ship. Crew members had to operate hand pumps and bale buckets continuously to prevent the ship from taking on too much water, a task that was exhausting and never-ending. The bilge water itself was contaminated with tar, oil, food particles, and human waste, creating a toxic soup that could cause serious health problems for anyone who came into contact with it. The cargo holds of Roman merchant ships were designed to maximize the amount of goods that could be transported, with little consideration for the needs of the crew members who had to work in these spaces. Amphorae containing olive oil and wine were stacked from floor to ceiling, creating narrow passages that were difficult to navigate and dangerous to work in when the ship was rolling in rough seas. Heavy ceramic containers would shift and break during storms, creating hazardous conditions for crew members who had to clean up the mess and salvage what they could of the damaged cargo. Navigation on Roman ships was primitive by modern standards, relying primarily on coastal landmarks, the position of stars, and basic understanding of wind patterns. This meant that voyages often took much longer than expected, stretching food and water supplies beyond their limits and forcing crews to resort to increasingly desperate measures to survive. When fresh water ran out, sailors would try to collect rainwater in whatever containers they could find, often drinking water that had been contaminated by the tarred ropes and wooden surfaces it ran across. When food supplies dwindled, they would eat anything they could catch from the sea, including fish that were sometimes spoiled or even poisonous. The Roman practice of carrying live animals aboard their ships added another layer of complexity and discomfort to maritime travel. Sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens were transported to provide fresh meat during long voyages, but these animals required food, water, and care that competed with the needs of the human crew. The animal waste and the smell of livestock created additional sanitation problems, and the noise and movement of frightened animals during storms added to the chaos and stress experienced by everyone aboard the ship. The social hierarchy aboard Roman merchant vessels was rigidly enforced, with wealthy passengers receiving the best accommodations, while crew members and poor passengers were relegated to the worst spaces in the ship. The contrast between the conditions experienced by different classes of people aboard the same vessel was stark, with some passengers enjoying private cabins and regular meals, while others were crowded into airless holds with minimal food and water. This inequality created tensions and resentments that could lead to conflicts and even mutinies when conditions became particularly desperate. The Roman military's approach to naval warfare created additional hardships for the crews of their warships, which were designed primarily for ramming and boarding enemy vessels rather than for long-term habitability. Roman warships carried large numbers of soldiers in addition to their sailing crews, creating overcrowded conditions that were even worse than those found on merchant vessels. The weapons and equipment carried by these soldiers took up valuable space that could have been used for crew quarters or supplies, and the weight of armor and weapons made the ships slower and less maneuverable in combat situations. The training regimen for Roman naval crews was brutal and demanding, with new recruits subjected to harsh discipline and dangerous working conditions that claimed many lives before men became experienced sailors. The Roman military's emphasis on discipline and obedience meant that crew members had no recourse when they were mistreated by their officers, and the penalties for insubordination or desertion were severe enough to deter most attempts at resistance or escape. Roman ships engaged in long-distance trade often carried mixed cargoes that included luxury goods, raw materials, and bulk commodities, creating complex loading and unloading procedures that required careful planning and coordination. The different requirements for storing and handling these various types of cargo meant that crew members had to be skilled in multiple trades and capable of adapting to changing conditions throughout the voyage. The valuable nature of many Roman cargoes also made these ships attractive targets for pirates, creating additional security concerns that affected every aspect of daily life aboard these vessels. The Viking longships that terrorized European coastlines from the 8th to 11th centuries CE were marvels of naval architecture, designed for speed, shallow draft navigation, and the ability to be carried overland between rivers. However, these sleek vessels offered virtually no protection from the harsh North Atlantic weather that Viking sailors regularly encountered. The open design that made longships so versatile also meant that crew members were constantly exposed to rain, snow, wind, and freezing temperatures that could cause hypothermia and frostbite within hours of departure. Vikings attempted to combat the cold by wearing multiple layers of wool and fur clothing, but these materials became heavy and uncomfortable when wet, and they never truly dried in the damp conditions aboard ship. The combination of wet clothing and cold air created perfect conditions for respiratory illnesses that could spread rapidly through the close-knit crew. Viking sailors also had to deal with the constant spray of icy seawater that soaked everything on board and made it nearly impossible to stay warm and dry during long voyages across the northern seas. Food preservation was a particular challenge for Viking expeditions, which could last for months as they explored new territories or conducted raids along distant coastlines. Vikings relied heavily on dried fish, salted meat, and hard bread that could withstand the damp conditions aboard their ships, but these preserved foods often became moldy or infested with insects during long voyages. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels that were prone to developing leaks, and the water itself often became contaminated with algae or bacteria that caused stomach problems and diarrhea among the crew. The psychological challenges faced by Viking sailors were compounded by their cultural beliefs about death and the afterlife. While Vikings were renowned for their bravery in battle, the prospect of dying at sea was particularly terrifying because it meant being denied entry to Valhalla, the warrior's paradise that awaited those who died gloriously in combat. This fear of a meaningless death in the cold waters of the ocean created additional stress for crews who were already dealing with the physical hardships of life aboard a longship. Medieval merchant vessels represented a slight improvement in some areas compared to their ancient predecessors, but they introduced new problems that made life aboard these ships equally miserable in different ways. The development of the cog, a sturdy sailing ship that became the backbone of European trade during the High Middle Ages, allowed for larger crews and more cargo capacity. But it also created opportunities for different types of suffering that previous generations of sailors had not experienced. The cog's design, with its high sides and deep hold, created better protection from rough seas than earlier vessel types. But it also resulted in ships that were poorly ventilated and extremely cramped below deck. The single large cargo hold that made cogs so efficient for carrying bulk goods also meant that crew members were relegated to small spaces around the edges of the ship, often sleeping in areas that were barely large enough for a grown man to lie down. The steep sides of the cog made it difficult for crew members to move around on deck during rough weather. And the high freeboard that protected the ship from waves also made it harder for sailors to perform routine tasks like fishing or collecting rainwater. The construction of medieval cogs involved new techniques that created stronger vessels, but also introduced new sources of discomfort and danger for their crews. The use of iron nails and bolts to fasten the hull planks together created a more watertight seal than earlier rope and peg construction methods. But the metal fittings were prone to rust and corrosion that could weaken the ship's structure over time. The iron components also conducted cold more effectively than wood, creating spots throughout the ship that were uncomfortably cold to touch during winter voyages. Medieval ships were often infested with rats, mice, and various insects that thrived in the dark, damp conditions below deck. These pests not only consumed precious food supplies, but also spread diseases that could devastate entire crews. The bubonic plague, which killed millions of people across Europe during the 14th century, was often spread by the fleas that lived on rats aboard merchant ships, making these vessels mobile disease factories that carried death from port to port across the known world. The rat problem aboard medieval ships was particularly severe because the design of these vessels provided numerous hiding places and nesting sites for rodents. The complex internal structure of cogs, with their multiple decks and compartments, created a maze of dark spaces where rats could breed and multiply without being detected by the crew. The rats consumed not only food supplies, but also rope, canvas, and wooden components of the ship itself, causing damage that could compromise the vessel's structural integrity and sailing performance. The attempts made by medieval sailors to control rat populations aboard their ships were largely ineffective and sometimes created additional problems. Cats were sometimes carried aboard ships to hunt rats, but these animals required food and care that competed with the needs of the human crew, and seasick cats were often unable to perform their pest control duties effectively. Poison was sometimes used to kill rats, but this created the risk of accidentally poisoning crew members and contaminating food supplies, and dead rats that were not promptly removed would rot and create additional sanitation problems. The social hierarchy aboard medieval ships created additional hardships for common sailors, who were often treated little better than slaves by the wealthy merchants and nobles who owned the vessels. Crew members were expected to work in dangerous conditions with minimal pay, and they had no legal recourse if they were injured or mistreated during the voyage. The feudal system that dominated European society extended to the seas, where a rigid class structure determined everything from sleeping arrangements to food allocation, with the poorest crew members receiving the worst accommodations and the most dangerous duties. The guild system that governed medieval trade created additional complications for sailors, who were often required to belong to specific organizations and follow complex rules and regulations that could conflict with the practical needs of shipboard life. Crew members who violated guild regulations could be fined or expelled from their profession, leaving them unable to find work aboard other vessels. The bureaucratic requirements of the guild system also created paperwork and administrative burdens that consumed time and resources that could have been used for more practical purposes. Medieval sailors also had to contend with increasingly sophisticated piracy, as various groups of seafaring raiders developed more organized and effective methods of attacking merchant vessels. The constant threat of pirate attacks created a climate of fear and tension aboard ships, with crew members forced to serve as both sailors and soldiers, depending on the circumstances they encountered. The weapons and armor carried for defense took up valuable space that could have been used for supplies or more comfortable accommodations. And the weight of these military necessities made ships slower and more difficult to maneuver in emergencies. The types of weapons carried aboard medieval merchant ships were often primitive and inadequate for defending against well-armed pirates, creating a false sense of security that could lead to overconfidence and poor decision-making during actual attacks. Crossbows, spears, and swords required training and practice to use effectively, but most merchant sailors were focused on their primary duties and had little time or opportunity to develop military skills. The presence of weapons aboard ship also created additional dangers during storms and rough weather, when loose equipment could cause serious injuries to crew members. The development of larger ocean-going vessels during the late medieval period brought new challenges that earlier sailors had never faced. Ships that ventured beyond the relatively calm waters of enclosed seas like the Mediterranean had to deal with the massive storms and towering waves of the open ocean, conditions that could reduce even experienced sailors to terrified passengers praying for survival. The wooden hulls of these early ocean vessels were not designed to withstand the tremendous forces generated by Atlantic storms, and structural failures were common occurrences that could leave crews stranded in sinking ships hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The size of these larger medieval ships created new problems in terms of crew management and coordination, as it became increasingly difficult for officers to communicate with and supervise large numbers of sailors working in different parts of the vessel. The complex rigging systems required to operate these ships demanded precise coordination and timing that was hard to achieve when crew members could not see or hear each other clearly. Mistakes in sail handling or ship management could have catastrophic consequences, making every maneuver a potential disaster that required constant vigilance and skill from every member of the crew. Navigation remained primitive throughout most of the medieval period, with sailors relying on dead reckoning, celestial observations, and basic compass readings to determine their position and course. The magnetic compasses used during this era were crude instruments that were easily affected by the iron fittings on the ships themselves, leading to navigation errors that could send vessels hundreds of miles off course. When ships became lost, crews faced the terrifying prospect of wandering the open ocean until their food and water supplies ran out, a fate that befell countless vessels whose disappearances remain mysteries to this day. The charts and maps available to medieval sailors were often inaccurate and incomplete, based on hearsay and speculation rather than systematic observation and measurement. Coastlines were frequently misrepresented, distances were wildly incorrect, and dangerous reefs and shoals were often unmarked or misplaced on the charts. Sailors who relied too heavily on these unreliable navigation aids could find themselves in serious trouble when the real world failed to match their expectations based on faulty information. The religious beliefs of medieval sailors added another layer of psychological stress to the already challenging conditions aboard these ships. The Catholic Church taught that the ocean was a place of chaos and evil, populated by monsters and demons that were constantly seeking to drag sinful souls down to hell. While these beliefs motivated some sailors to live more virtuous lives, they also created intense anxiety and fear that could make even routine voyages feel like journeys through a supernatural realm of danger and temptation. The religious obligations imposed on medieval sailors included regular prayers, fasting, and observance of holy days that could interfere with the practical requirements of ship operation and navigation. Crew members were expected to maintain their spiritual discipline even under the most challenging conditions, and failure to observe religious requirements was believed to bring divine punishment upon the entire ship and crew. These obligations created additional stress and consumed time that could have been used for rest or maintenance activities. Medical care aboard medieval ships was virtually non-existent, with most crews relying on folk remedies, superstitions, and prayer to deal with injuries and illnesses. The few individuals who served as ship surgeons were typically barbers or other tradesmen with no formal medical training, and their treatments often caused more harm than good. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, using tools that were rarely cleaned between patients, creating perfect conditions for infections that could spread throughout the crew. The medical knowledge available to medieval sailors was based primarily on ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been translated and retranslated multiple times, often losing accuracy and introducing errors along the way. The theory of the four humors dominated medical thinking, leading to treatments that involved bloodletting, purging, and other procedures that weakened patients rather than helping them recover from their ailments. The belief that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids led to treatments that were often completely inappropriate for the actual conditions being treated. The surgical instruments carried aboard medieval ships were crude and often multi-purpose tools that were used for everything from carpentry to food preparation as well as medical procedures. Knives, saws, and other cutting implements were rarely sterilized between uses, and the concept of antiseptic surgery was completely unknown. The lack of proper medical supplies meant that wounds were often dressed with whatever materials were available, including dirty cloth, rope fibers, or even leaves and moss that could introduce additional bacteria and foreign matter into injuries. The treatment of common shipboard injuries, such as cuts, burns, and broken bones, was primitive and often made conditions worse rather than better. Burns were typically treated with various animal fats or oils that could trap heat and bacteria against the skin, leading to infections and scarring. Broken bones were set using splints made from whatever wood was available, but the lack of understanding about proper bone alignment meant that many fractures healed incorrectly, leaving sailors with permanent disabilities that affected their ability to work. The diet aboard medieval ships was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate, consisting primarily of salted pork, hardtack biscuits, and whatever fish could be caught along the way. Fresh fruits and vegetables were impossible to preserve for long voyages, leading to widespread vitamin deficiencies that weakened immune systems and made crews more susceptible to disease. The water supplies were often contaminated with bacteria and algae, but sailors had no choice but to drink whatever was available, even when it tasted foul and caused stomach problems. The hardtack biscuits that formed the staple carbohydrate source for medieval sailors were made from flour and water that was baked until it was completely dried out, creating a product that could last for months without spoiling but was extremely hard and difficult to eat. These biscuits often became infested with weevils and other insects during storage, but hungry sailors had to eat them anyway, picking out the larger bugs and trying to ignore the smaller ones that were too numerous to remove. The biscuits had to be soaked in water, wine, or soup before eating, but the liquid used for soaking was often contaminated or in short supply. The salted pork carried aboard medieval ships was preserved using techniques that could keep the meat edible for extended periods, but the preservation process made the meat extremely salty and tough. The high salt content created additional health problems, as it increased the crew's need for fresh water that was already rationed and often contaminated. The preserved meat also lost most of its nutritional value during the preservation process, providing calories but little in the way of vitamins or minerals necessary for maintaining health during long voyages. The fishing practices aboard medieval ships were more advanced than those of earlier periods, but they still presented significant challenges and dangers for crew members. Nets had to be deployed and retrieved by hand, requiring multiple sailors to work in coordination while dealing with the rolling motion of the ship. Fishing lines and hooks were primitive and often broke under the strain of catching larger fish, and crew members who fell overboard while fishing had little chance of survival in the cold waters of the North Atlantic.
The preservation of fresh fish caught during voyages was another major challenge, as medieval sailors had no effective methods for keeping fish fresh for more than a day or two.
Fish that could not be eaten immediately had to be salted or dried, using techniques that were not always successful, especially in humid conditions where mold and bacteria could spoil the fish before the preservation process was complete. Spoiled fish could cause serious food poisoning, but hungry crews often had no choice but to eat questionable food rather than face starvation. Sleep aboard medieval ships was nearly impossible for most crew members, who had to rest wherever they could find space among the cargo, rigging, and other equipment that filled every available inch of the vessel. Hammocks had not yet been invented, so sailors slept on hard wooden surfaces that left them sore and exhausted after a few hours of fitful rest. The constant motion of the ship made it difficult to achieve deep sleep, and the noise of creaking timbers, flapping sails, and shouting crew members meant that there was rarely any real quiet or peace aboard these vessels. The sleeping areas available to common sailors were often located in the dampest and most uncomfortable parts of the ship, where bilge water would slosh around during rough weather, and the smell of rotting cargo would make rest difficult. Crew members had to sleep in their clothes to stay warm, but wet clothing never dried completely in the humid conditions below deck, leading to skin problems and respiratory illnesses that could affect entire crews. The lack of adequate bedding meant that sailors often slept directly on wooden planks or rough cargo, leading to pressure sores and joint problems that could become chronic conditions. The development of gunpowder weapons during the late medieval period added new dangers to life aboard ships, as naval warfare became increasingly deadly and destructive. Ships that carried cannons and other firearms faced the constant risk of explosions from faulty powder, improper storage, or enemy fire that could ignite the ship's magazine and destroy the entire vessel in seconds. The noise and smoke from these weapons made conditions below deck even more unbearable, and the risk of being burned alive in a gunpowder explosion became another fear that sailors had to live with every day. The storage of gunpowder aboard medieval ships required special precautions that often conflicted with the practical needs of ship operation and crew comfort. Powder magazines had to be kept dry and secure, which meant that valuable space was taken away from crew quarters and storage for other essential supplies. The presence of large quantities of explosive materials created constant anxiety among crew members, who were aware that a single spark or accident could destroy the entire ship and everyone aboard it. The training required to operate medieval firearms effectively was extensive and dangerous, as crew members had to learn to handle volatile materials and complex weapons while dealing with the challenging conditions aboard a moving ship. Accidents during training exercises were common, and many sailors suffered burns, injuries, or death from premature explosions, misfires, and other problems with early gunpowder weapons. The psychological stress of working with these dangerous weapons added another layer of anxiety to the already challenging conditions of medieval sea travel. As we move into the early modern period, we see some improvements in ship design and construction, but many of the fundamental problems that had plagued ancient and medieval sailors persisted well into the age of exploration. The great voyages of discovery undertaken by explorers like Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan were epic journeys that opened new trade routes and expanded human knowledge of the world. But they were also exercises in human endurance that tested the limits of what people could survive under the most adverse conditions imaginable. The technological advances of the Renaissance period led to improvements in shipbuilding techniques, navigation instruments, and maritime knowledge. But these improvements came slowly and were not always implemented effectively. Many ship owners and captains were reluctant to invest in new technologies or methods that could improve conditions for their crews, preferring to maximize profits by maintaining traditional practices that prioritized cargo capacity over crew welfare. The result was that sailors continued to endure terrible conditions even as the knowledge and tools existed to make their lives more bearable. The ships used for these voyages of discovery were larger and more seaworthy than their predecessors, but they were still essentially floating prisons for the crews who spent months or even years confined within their wooden walls. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship during his first voyage to the Americas, was only about 80 feet long and carried a crew of 40 men in conditions that modern safety regulations would consider criminal. The crew slept wherever they could find space, ate whatever food remained edible after weeks at sea, and dealt with disease and injury without any of the medical knowledge or equipment that we take for granted today. The design of these early exploration vessels reflected the priorities and understanding of their builders, who were primarily concerned with creating ships that could carry sufficient supplies for long voyages while remaining seaworthy in ocean conditions. The human needs of the crew were considered secondary to these practical requirements, leading to ships that were efficient cargo carriers, but terrible places for people to live and work. The single-minded focus on exploration and profit meant that crew comfort was sacrificed in favor of maximizing the ship's capability to complete its mission. The psychological stress of these voyages of discovery was particularly intense because the crews were venturing into completely unknown territories where no human being had ever traveled before. They had no idea what dangers awaited them, how long their journeys would take, or whether they would ever return home to see their families again. The fear of sailing off the edge of the world, encountering sea monsters, or being trapped in regions where ships could not survive created a constant state of anxiety that affected every aspect of daily life aboard these vessels. The uncertainty surrounding these voyages of discovery created unique psychological challenges that earlier sailors had not faced to the same degree. While ancient and medieval sailors dealt with known dangers like storms, pirates, and equipment failures, the crews of exploration vessels had to cope with the fear of the unknown and the possibility that they were sailing toward their own destruction. The myths and legends surrounding the ocean that had developed over centuries of maritime travel included stories of sea monsters, whirlpools that could swallow entire ships, and cursed regions where vessels would become trapped forever. The cultural and religious beliefs of exploration crews often intensified their fears about venturing into unknown waters, as many sailors believed that they were violating divine law by attempting to explore regions that God had not intended for human habitation. The Catholic Church's teachings about the limits of the known world and the dangers of seeking knowledge that was reserved for divine understanding created additional psychological pressure for crews who were already dealing with the practical challenges of long ocean voyages. The leadership challenges faced by captains of exploration vessels were enormous, as they had to maintain discipline and morale among crews who were increasingly fearful and desperate as voyages stretched on longer than expected. The promise of wealth and glory that motivated these expeditions often proved insufficient to sustain crew morale when faced with the daily reality of hardship, danger, and uncertainty. Mutinies and other forms of crew rebellion were constant threats that captains had to manage through a combination of inspiration, intimidation, and careful resource management. The Spanish treasure fleets that carried gold and silver from the Americas back to Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries faced unique challenges that combined all the traditional hardships of sea travel with the additional dangers of carrying enormous wealth through pirate-infested waters. These galleons were heavily loaded with precious metals, which made them slow and difficult to maneuver, perfect targets for the English, French, and Dutch privateers who hunted them relentlessly across the Atlantic Ocean. The construction of Spanish treasure galleons represented a compromise between cargo capacity, defensive capability, and seaworthiness that often resulted in vessels that performed poorly in all three areas. These ships were larger and more heavily armed than typical merchant vessels, but the weight of their cannons and the space required for their crews reduced the amount of cargo they could carry. The heavy armament also made the ships top-heavy and unstable in rough weather, increasing the risk of capsizing during storms. The crews of Spanish treasure ships lived in constant fear of attack, knowing that capture meant certain death or slavery for most sailors, while the lucky few might be held for ransom if they were valuable enough to their captors. The need to carry large quantities of weapons and ammunition for defense further reduced the space available for crew quarters and supplies, making these voyages even more uncomfortable and dangerous than typical merchant expeditions. The defensive preparations required for treasure ship voyages created additional hardships for crew members, who had to serve as both sailors and soldiers throughout their journeys. The constant state of readiness required for defending against attacks meant that normal shipboard routines were frequently interrupted by drills, watch duties, and maintenance of weapons and fortifications. The psychological stress of living under constant threat of attack created a climate of fear and tension that affected every aspect of daily life aboard these vessels. The wealth carried by these ships also created internal conflicts among crew members, who were often tempted to mutiny and steal the treasure for themselves rather than deliver it to the Spanish crown. The captains of these vessels had to maintain constant vigilance against their own crews while also watching for external threats, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that made life aboard these ships psychologically unbearable for everyone involved. The security measures implemented aboard Spanish treasure ships included locked storage compartments, armed guards, and surveillance systems that made crew members feel like prisoners rather than valued employees. The constant monitoring and restriction of movement created resentment among sailors who were already dealing with the challenging conditions of ocean travel, And the harsh punishments imposed for even minor infractions created a climate of fear that affected crew performance and morale. The Spanish colonial system created unique challenges for treasure ship crews, who had to navigate complex political and economic relationships between different colonial administrators, local officials, and indigenous communities. The bureaucratic requirements for documenting and transporting treasure created additional paperwork and administrative burdens that consumed time and resources while adding little practical value to the voyage operations. The Spanish Inquisition's influence extended to maritime activities, with crew members subject to investigation and persecution for religious beliefs or practices that were deemed inappropriate by church authorities. The fear of being accused of heresy or other religious crimes created additional psychological stress for sailors who were already dealing with the challenges of dangerous ocean voyages, while the presence of religious investigators aboard some ships created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that undermined crew cohesion. The Spanish guild system governing maritime trades created complex rules and regulations that often conflicted with the practical needs of ship operation and crew management. Sailors who violated guild requirements could be fined, imprisoned, or banned from their profession, creating additional legal and economic risks for crew members who were simply trying to perform their duties effectively under challenging conditions. The Spanish taxation system imposed heavy duties on treasure shipments that affected crew wages and working conditions, as ship owners attempted to maximize profits by reducing expenses related to crew comfort and safety. The complex tax regulations also created opportunities for corruption and fraud that could implicate innocent crew members in criminal activities, adding legal risks to the already dangerous nature of treasure ship voyages. The Spanish military's approach to convoy organization created additional challenges for treasure ship crews, who had to coordinate their activities with military vessels that operated under different command structures and priorities. The need to maintain formation and follow military protocols often conflicted with the practical requirements of merchant ship operation, creating confusion and inefficiency that increased the risks faced by civilian crew members. The Spanish colonial economy's dependence on slave labor created moral and practical challenges for treasure ship crews, who were often required to transport enslaved people as cargo while maintaining their own humanity and dignity. The presence of enslaved people aboard these vessels created additional security concerns and logistical challenges, while the moral contradictions of the slavery system created psychological stress for crew members who were forced to participate in the brutal exploitation of other human beings. The Spanish legal system's treatment of maritime crimes and disputes often favored wealthy shipowners and merchants over common sailors, creating a system where crew members had little recourse when they were mistreated or cheated by their employers. The complex legal procedures and expensive court costs made it nearly impossible for ordinary sailors to seek justice for wage theft, personal injuries, or other forms of exploitation they suffered during their voyages. The Spanish communication systems used for coordinating treasure fleet activities were slow and unreliable, often leaving individual ships and crews without current information about changing political conditions, pirate activities, or other threats they might encounter during their voyages.
The isolation created by poor communication systems meant that crews often had to make critical decisions without access to important information that could affect their safety and success.
The Spanish cultural emphasis on honor and reputation created additional pressure for treasure ship crews, who were expected to maintain their dignity and courage even under the most challenging and dangerous conditions. The social stigma associated with appearing cowardly or incompetent could affect a sailor's future employment opportunities and social standing, creating psychological pressure to take unnecessary risks or conceal problems that should have been addressed openly.
The Spanish religious calendar imposed numerous holy days and religious obligations that could interfere with voyage schedules and practical ship operations.
Crews were expected to observe elaborate religious ceremonies and participate in religious activities that consumed time and resources, while failure to demonstrate proper religious devotion could result in accusations of heresy or other serious charges. The Spanish bureaucratic system created extensive documentation requirements for treasure shipments that consumed significant time and resources while adding little practical value to voyage operations. Crew members had to participate in inventory procedures, record-keeping activities, and other administrative tasks that took time away from essential ship maintenance and operational duties. The Spanish colonial administration's corruption and inefficiency created additional challenges for treasure ship crews, who often had to deal with conflicting orders, delayed supplies, and administrative incompetence that affected their ability to prepare properly for dangerous ocean voyages. The political instability and infighting among colonial officials created uncertainty and confusion that made it difficult for crews to plan and execute their voyages effectively. The slave ships that carried millions of African people to the Americas represent perhaps the most horrific conditions ever endured aboard any type of vessel in human history. While the focus is usually on the unimaginable suffering of the enslaved people who were packed into the holds like cargo, the conditions for the sailors who operated these ships were also incredibly harsh and dangerous. The crew members on slave ships faced constant threats of disease, rebellion, and psychological trauma that left many of them permanently damaged by their experiences. The design of slave ships was specifically intended to maximize the number of human beings that could be transported in a single voyage, with no consideration for the comfort or welfare of either the enslaved people or the crew members who sailed these vessels. The modifications made to convert merchant ships for slave transport created cramped and unhealthy conditions throughout the vessel, as every available space was utilized for human cargo or the supplies needed to sustain them during the voyage. The smell aboard slave ships was so overwhelming that it could be detected from miles away by other vessels, and the crew members who worked below deck had to endure this nauseating environment for months at a time. Many sailors requested hazard pay for working on slave ships, and some refused to serve on these vessels altogether because of the reputation they had for high mortality rates among both the enslaved people and the crew members who transported them. The disease outbreaks that were common aboard slave ships affected crew members as well as the human cargo, as the crowded and unsanitary conditions created perfect environments for the spread of dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, and other deadly illnesses. Crew members who became sick had little chance of receiving adequate medical care, as the ship's limited medical resources were typically reserved for maintaining the health of the enslaved people who represented the voyage's profit potential. The psychological trauma experienced by crew members on slave ships was severe and long-lasting, as they witnessed daily suffering and death on a scale that was difficult for human minds to process or accept. Many sailors who worked on slave ships developed drinking problems, mental illness, and other psychological disorders that affected their ability to function in normal society after their voyages ended. The moral conflicts created by participating in the slave trade caused additional stress for crew members who struggled to reconcile their actions with their personal beliefs and values. The economic incentives that drove the slave trade created a system where crew members were rewarded for maximizing the number of enslaved people transported while minimizing the resources devoted to their care and welfare. This profit-driven approach to human transportation created conditions that were inhumane, even by the standards of the era, as ship owners and captains competed to pack the maximum number of people into the minimum amount of space. The insurance practices related to slave ships created additional moral hazards, as policies that covered the loss of human cargo created financial incentives for crew members to treat enslaved people as disposable property rather than human beings. The practice of throwing sick or dying enslaved people overboard to collect insurance money created additional psychological trauma for crew members who were forced to participate in or witness these horrific practices. The legal framework governing the slave trade provided protection for ship owners and crew members who committed acts that would be considered crimes in other contexts, creating a system where the most brutal and inhumane treatment of enslaved people was not only permitted but often encouraged by economic incentives and legal immunity. The cultural attitudes that supported slavery created psychological defense mechanisms among crew members who had to dehumanize enslaved people in order to cope with their participation in the slave trade. These psychological adaptations often had lasting effects on crew members' ability to form normal relationships and participate in humane society after their maritime careers ended. The health risks faced by crew members on slave ships included exposure to diseases that thrived in the crowded and unsanitary conditions created by the slave trade. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through slave ships, affecting crew members as well as enslaved people, and creating mortality rates that were among the highest in all forms of maritime activity. The security challenges created by the constant threat of rebellion aboard slave ships required crew members to maintain constant vigilance and readiness for violence, creating psychological stress and physical exhaustion that affected their performance of other essential duties. The weapons and restraints used to control enslaved people created additional dangers for crew members, who could be injured by their own security measures during storms or other emergency situations. The communication difficulties created by language barriers between crew members and enslaved people from different African cultures made it nearly impossible to provide adequate medical care, address basic needs, or prevent conflicts that could endanger the entire ship. The inability to communicate effectively with enslaved people also made it difficult for crew members to understand and respond to health problems or other issues that could affect voyage safety and success. The logistical challenges of providing food, water, and basic sanitation for large numbers of enslaved people in confined spaces created additional work and stress for crew members who were already dealing with the demanding requirements of operating ocean-going vessels. The competition for resources between crew needs and the basic survival requirements of enslaved people created conflicts and difficult decisions that added psychological stress to already challenging working conditions. The social isolation experienced by crew members who worked on slave ships was severe, as the nature of their work made them pariahs in many communities and limited their ability to form normal relationships with people who had not shared their experiences. The stigma associated with the slave trade affected crew members' families and communities, creating additional social and psychological consequences that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in maritime activities. The political tensions created by the gradual abolition of slavery in different regions created additional risks for crew members on slave ships who could find themselves on the wrong side of changing laws and social attitudes. The enforcement of anti-slavery laws created legal risks for crew members who continued to participate in the slave trade, while the political conflicts surrounding abolition created additional dangers for ships and crews operating in contested waters. The technological limitations of slave ship design created additional hardships for crew members, who had to operate vessels that were modified for human cargo transport in ways that often compromised their seaworthiness and safety. The structural modifications needed to create maximum cargo capacity often weakened the ships and made them more vulnerable to storms and other maritime hazards, increasing the risks faced by crew members as well as enslaved people. The environmental conditions aboard slave ships were so extreme that they created health problems for crew members as well as enslaved people, with poor air quality, contaminated water supplies, and unsanitary conditions that affected everyone aboard these vessels. The stench from slave ships was so powerful that it could be detected from miles away, creating additional psychological stress for crew members who had to live and work in these conditions for months at a time. The documentation requirements for slave voyages created additional bureaucratic burdens for crew members who had to participate in record-keeping activities that treated human beings as cargo while maintaining detailed inventories of their human cargo. The psychological impact of reducing human beings to statistics and inventory items created additional moral stress for crew members who retained some sense of humanity despite their participation in the slave trade. The transition from wooden sailing ships to steam-powered vessels during the 19th century brought some improvements in terms of speed and reliability, but it also introduced new types of hardships that sailors had never experienced before. The coal-fired engines that powered these early steamships created incredibly hot and dangerous working conditions for the stokers and engineers who kept them running, with temperatures in the engine rooms often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit even in cold weather. The introduction of steam power revolutionized maritime transportation, but created entirely new categories of suffering for the men who worked aboard these vessels. The coal-burning engines required constant feeding, with stokers working in shifts around the clock to shovel coal into the furnaces that powered the ship's engines. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, performed in conditions that were reminiscent of the worst industrial factories of the era, except with the added challenge of doing this work aboard a moving ship in all weather conditions. The coal bunkers aboard early steamships were dark, cramped spaces where coal dust filled the air and made breathing difficult for the workers who had to retrieve fuel for the engines. The coal dust caused respiratory problems that could develop into serious lung diseases over time, and the fine particles got into everything, covering workers in a layer of black grime that was impossible to wash off completely with the limited washing facilities available aboard ship. The constant exposure to coal dust also created fire hazards, as the combustible particles could ignite from sparks or excessive heat. The engine rooms of early steamships were hellish environments where workers had to endure extreme heat, deafening noise, and dangerous machinery that could maim or kill anyone who made a mistake or lost their footing. The steam engines themselves were massive and complex machines that required constant attention and maintenance, with boilers that could explode if they were not properly monitored and maintained. The risk of scalding from steam leaks or burns from hot metal surfaces was constant, and many engine room workers suffered permanent injuries from accidents with the machinery. The coal smoke from these early steam engines contaminated the air throughout the ship, causing respiratory problems for everyone aboard and covering everything in a layer of black soot that made it impossible to stay clean. The noise from the engines was constant and deafening, making it difficult for crew members to communicate or get adequate rest even when they were off duty. The vibrations from the engines also caused structural stress on the ships themselves, leading to frequent mechanical failures that could leave vessels stranded in dangerous situations. The constant vibration from steam engines created new types of physical problems for crew members who had to endure the continuous shaking and rattling that affected every part of the ship. The vibrations made it difficult to perform delicate tasks, caused fatigue and discomfort even during rest periods, and could loosen bolts and fittings throughout the vessel, creating maintenance problems that required constant attention. The noise and vibration also made it nearly impossible to detect other important sounds, such as changes in weather conditions or approaching vessels that could pose threats to the ship's safety. The working conditions in the coal bunkers and engine rooms of early steamships were so dangerous that many sailors compared them to working in mines or factories, except with the added risk of being at sea in a vessel that could sink if the engines failed at the wrong moment. The physical demands of shoveling coal for hours at a time in extreme heat led to exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke among the crew members responsible for keeping the engines running. The coal-fired boilers that powered early steamships required enormous quantities of fresh water to operate safely, creating new challenges for water storage and conservation that competed with the drinking water needs of the crew. The boilers had to be regularly cleaned and maintained to prevent the buildup of scale and corrosion that could cause dangerous failures, and this maintenance work had to be performed in the same hot, dangerous conditions where the engines operated. The risk of boiler explosions was a constant concern that created additional psychological stress for crew members who were aware that a single mechanical failure could destroy the entire ship in seconds. The fuel requirements of steam-powered vessels created new logistical challenges that affected crew comfort and safety in unexpected ways. Ships had to carry enormous quantities of coal, which took up space that could have been used for crew quarters, food storage, or other necessities. The weight of the coal affected the ship's handling characteristics and stability, and the process of loading and unloading coal in port was dirty, dangerous work that exposed crew members to injury and illness. Despite all these technological advances, many of the fundamental problems that had plagued sailors for thousands of years persisted well into the modern era. Food spoilage remained a serious issue until the development of reliable refrigeration, and scurvy continued to kill sailors until the British Navy finally accepted that citrus fruits could prevent the disease in the late 18th century. Even then, many shipping companies were reluctant to provide proper nutrition for their crews because of the additional cost and complexity involved. The development of canning and food preservation techniques during the 19th century offered new possibilities for improving shipboard nutrition, but the early canned foods were often of poor quality and sometimes dangerous to consume. The canning process was not yet perfected, and many canned goods contained harmful bacteria or toxic chemicals from the preservation process. The tin cans themselves were often made with lead solder that could leach into the food and cause lead poisoning among crew members who consumed large quantities of canned provisions. The advent of ice-making machines and early refrigeration systems offered some improvements in food preservation, but these technologies were expensive and unreliable, requiring constant maintenance and resources aboard ship. The space and resources aboard ship were valuable aboard ship. The mechanical refrigeration systems of the 19th century were prone to breakdowns that could leave crews without any means of preserving fresh food during long voyages. And the ammonia-based refrigerants used in early systems were toxic and dangerous if they leaked. The social conditions aboard ships also remained harsh throughout most of human history, with rigid hierarchies and brutal discipline that would be considered abusive by modern standards. Sailors who violated the rules or showed any signs of insubordination faced punishments ranging from reduced rations to flogging with a cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip that could leave permanent scars and cause serious injuries that often became infected in the unsanitary conditions aboard ship. The disciplinary practices aboard ships reflected the authoritarian nature of maritime society, where captains had almost unlimited power over their crews and could impose punishments that would be considered torture by modern standards. The use of physical punishment was considered necessary to maintain order and discipline aboard ships, where mutiny could be fatal for everyone involved. But the harsh treatment of crew members often created resentment and hostility that made ships less safe and efficient. The legal system that governed maritime affairs gave captains broad authority to deal with crew problems as they saw fit, with little oversight or appeal process for sailors who felt they had been treated unfairly. The isolation of ships at sea meant that abusive captains could mistreat their crews without fear of immediate consequences, and the economic dependence of sailors on their employment made it difficult for them to seek justice for mistreatment even after voyages ended. The development of accurate chronometers and improved navigation techniques during the 18th century reduced the risk of becoming lost at sea, but storms and other natural disasters remained constant threats that could destroy even the most well-built vessels. The sinking of ships like the Titanic in 1912 demonstrated that even the most advanced technology of the time could not guarantee safe passage across the world's oceans, and that the sea remained a dangerous and unpredictable environment that demanded respect and preparation from anyone who dared to venture upon it. The weather prediction capabilities available to sailors throughout most of history were extremely limited, based primarily on folk wisdom and observation of natural phenomena that were not always reliable indicators of changing conditions. Barometers and other meteorological instruments provided some improvement in weather forecasting, but the science of meteorology was still in its infancy and could not provide the detailed and accurate forecasts that modern sailors take for granted. The communication systems available to ships throughout most of history were primitive and unreliable, consisting primarily of signal flags, lights, and other visual methods that were useless in poor weather or at night. The development of radio communication in the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided some improvement in ship-to-shore communication, but the early radio systems were unreliable and had limited range, leaving ships essentially isolated from the outside world during most of their voyages. Throughout all these centuries of maritime development, one constant theme emerges: the incredible resilience and determination of the human beings who chose to make their living on the sea despite the terrible conditions they knew they would face. These sailors, merchants, explorers, and adventurers endured hardships that most modern people could not even imagine, driven by a combination of economic necessity, curiosity about the world, and sheer courage that enabled them to push the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. The maritime communities that developed around the world's ports and harbors created unique cultures and traditions that helped sailors cope with the challenges of their profession. These communities provided support networks, shared knowledge, and cultural practices that helped individuals and families deal with the risks and hardships of maritime life. The songs, stories, and customs that emerged from these communities reflected both the dangers of seafaring and the pride that sailors took in their ability to master one of humanity's most challenging environments. The stories of survival and endurance that emerge from the history of ancient shipping are testaments to the human spirit and our ability to adapt to even the most adverse circumstances. Sailors learned to navigate by the stars, to predict weather patterns from subtle changes in wind and wave conditions, and to survive on minimal rations for months at a time. They developed their own cultures and traditions that helped them cope with the isolation and danger of life at sea, creating bonds of brotherhood and mutual dependence that often lasted throughout their lives. The technological improvements that gradually made sea travel safer and more comfortable were often driven by the experiences and innovations of the sailors themselves, who understood better than anyone else what changes were needed to make their working conditions more bearable. The development of better ship designs, navigation instruments, and safety equipment was a slow process that took place over many centuries, with each generation building upon the knowledge and experience of those who came before them. The evolution of maritime law and labor practices was similarly gradual, with improvements in working conditions and crew rights coming slowly and often only after tragic accidents or disasters that highlighted the need for better safety standards and worker protections. The formation of maritime unions and professional organizations gave sailors more collective bargaining power and helped establish minimum standards for wages, working conditions, and safety equipment. Even today, despite all the advances in modern shipping technology, life aboard commercial vessels can still be challenging and dangerous. Modern sailors have access to GPS navigation, satellite communications, weather forecasting, and safety equipment that their predecessors could never have imagined. But they still face risks from storms, mechanical failures, and the inherent dangers of working on the ocean. The difference is that modern ships are designed with crew comfort and safety as primary considerations, not afterthoughts to be addressed only after cargo capacity and profit margins have been maximized. The lessons learned from thousands of years of maritime history have helped create international safety standards and regulations that protect modern sailors from the worst conditions that their predecessors had to endure. Organizations like the International Maritime Organization work constantly to improve safety standards and ensure that crew members have access to adequate food, water, medical care, and living conditions that meet basic human needs. The modern shipping industry, while still challenging and sometimes dangerous, operates under regulations and oversight that would have been unimaginable to ancient and medieval sailors. Modern crew quarters include private or semi-private cabins, adequate ventilation and heating, recreational facilities, and communication systems that allow sailors to stay in contact with their families during long voyages. Medical facilities and trained medical personnel are required on larger vessels, and emergency evacuation procedures ensure that seriously injured or ill crew members can receive proper medical care. The International Labor Organization and other international bodies have established comprehensive standards for maritime working conditions that address everything from minimum wage requirements to maximum working hours, rest periods, food quality, and safety equipment. These standards are enforced through port inspections and international agreements that can result in serious consequences for ship owners who fail to provide adequate working conditions for their crews. The technological advances that have transformed modern shipping include GPS navigation systems that provide precise positioning information regardless of weather conditions, satellite communication systems that allow constant contact with shore-based support, weather forecasting services that provide detailed predictions of sea conditions, and emergency beacons that can summon rescue services from anywhere in the world's oceans. The safety equipment required on modern ships includes lifeboats and life rafts with sufficient capacity for all crew members and passengers, immersion suits and life jackets designed to protect people in cold water, emergency food and water supplies that can sustain survivors for weeks, and sophisticated fire suppression systems that can control blazes that would have destroyed ancient vessels in minutes. The medical facilities aboard modern ships include sick bays equipped with diagnostic equipment, surgical instruments, and pharmaceutical supplies that would have seemed miraculous to ancient sailors. Telemedicine systems allow ships' officers to consult with doctors on shore for guidance in treating serious medical conditions, while helicopter evacuation services can remove critically injured or ill crew members from ships at sea. The food service systems on modern vessels include refrigeration and freezing equipment that can preserve fresh foods for months, water purification systems that provide safe drinking water from seawater, and galley facilities that can prepare nutritious meals for large crews under all weather conditions. The understanding of nutrition and food safety has eliminated the vitamin deficiency diseases that killed countless ancient sailors. The working hour regulations that govern modern shipping limit the amount of time that crew members can work without rest, ensure adequate sleep periods, and provide for regular shore leave that allows sailors to maintain connections with their families and communities. These regulations address the psychological and social needs of maritime workers in ways that were never considered during earlier periods of maritime history. The training and certification requirements for modern sailors ensure that crew members have the knowledge and skills necessary to perform their duties safely and effectively. Maritime academies and training centers provide comprehensive education in seamanship, navigation, safety procedures, and emergency response that prepares sailors for the challenges they will face at sea. The career development opportunities available to modern sailors include advancement pathways that can lead from entry-level positions to officer ranks and shore-based management positions. The professional recognition and social respect accorded to modern maritime workers is far different from the social stigma that often attached to sailors throughout most of human history. The environmental regulations governing modern shipping address the impact of maritime activities on ocean ecosystems and climate change, requiring ship owners to use cleaner fuels, manage waste responsibly, and minimize their environmental footprint. These regulations reflect a growing understanding of humanity's responsibility to protect the marine environment that sustains all life on Earth. The insurance and liability systems that protect modern sailors provide compensation for injuries and illnesses suffered during their maritime careers. Death benefits for families of sailors who are killed in maritime accidents, and legal protections that ensure fair treatment by employers and government agencies. The technological monitoring systems aboard modern ships provide real-time information about vessel performance, weather conditions, and safety systems that allow crews to identify and address problems before they become dangerous. These systems represent the culmination of thousands of years of maritime experience and technological development. The international cooperation that characterizes modern maritime activities includes search and rescue coordination between different nations, shared weather and navigation information, and standardized safety procedures that ensure consistent protection for sailors regardless of their nationality or the flag under which their ship operates. The quality of life aboard modern ships, while still demanding and sometimes difficult, represents an enormous improvement over the conditions endured by ancient sailors who faced the same oceans with primitive technology and no safety net. The transformation from the horrible conditions of ancient ships to the regulated and protected environment of modern vessels represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in improving working conditions and protecting human welfare. The evolution of ship design and maritime technology represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, demonstrating our ability to learn from past mistakes and continuously improve upon existing systems and methods. The terrible conditions that ancient sailors endured were not simply accepted as inevitable. They were gradually addressed and overcome through human ingenuity, determination, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of seafaring people who refused to accept that suffering at sea was simply the price of maritime commerce and exploration. Looking back at this long history of human struggle against the challenges of sea travel, we can appreciate both how far we have come and how much we owe to the brave individuals who endured these hardships to expand human knowledge and capability. The merchants who risked their lives to establish trade routes. The explorers who ventured into unknown waters to map new territories. And the ordinary sailors who kept these vessels running despite terrible conditions, all contributed to the gradual improvement of maritime technology and the expansion of human civilization across the globe. The economic forces that drove maritime expansion often came at tremendous human cost, as ship owners and merchants prioritized profits over crew welfare in ways that would be unthinkable today. The competitive nature of maritime commerce meant that companies that spent money on crew comfort and safety were at a disadvantage compared to those that minimized expenses by providing only the bare minimum necessary for survival. This economic pressure perpetuated poor conditions aboard ships for centuries, even as the knowledge and technology existed to make improvements. The role of government regulation in improving maritime conditions was minimal throughout most of history, with ship owners largely free to operate their vessels as they saw fit, regardless of the impact on crew welfare. The concept of worker safety regulations and government oversight of working conditions was foreign to most societies until well into the modern era, leaving sailors vulnerable to exploitation and abuse with little recourse for improving their situations. The insurance industry played an interesting role in maritime development, as insurers were primarily concerned with protecting their investments in ships and cargo rather than the welfare of crew members. This focus on protecting property rather than people meant that insurance requirements often led to improvements in ship construction and navigation equipment without corresponding improvements in crew quarters or working conditions. The story of horrible conditions on ancient ships is ultimately a story about human determination and our refusal to be defeated by even the most challenging circumstances. It reminds us that the comfortable and safe world we live in today was built upon the sacrifices and endurance of countless individuals who faced dangers and hardships that we can barely imagine. Their legacy lives on in every modern ship that carries cargo safely across the world's oceans, in every navigation system that prevents vessels from becoming lost at sea, and in every safety regulation that protects the lives and well-being of the people who still choose to make their living on the water. The cultural impact of maritime trade and exploration extended far beyond the economic benefits, as the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between distant civilizations helped shape the development of human society in ways that are still evident today. The spices, textiles, precious metals, and other goods carried by ancient ships helped connect isolated communities and create the first truly global economy. But this progress came at the cost of enormous human suffering among the sailors who made these connections possible. The environmental impact of ancient shipping was relatively minimal compared to modern industrial activities, but the demand for shipbuilding materials led to deforestation and resource depletion in many coastal regions. The construction of large fleets required enormous quantities of timber, rope, canvas, and metal, creating pressure on natural resources that sometimes led to conflict and environmental degradation. The medical knowledge gained from treating sailors and understanding the health problems associated with long voyages at sea contributed to advances in medicine and public health that benefited society as a whole. The recognition that certain foods could prevent scurvy, the understanding of how diseases spread in crowded conditions, and the development of surgical techniques for treating traumatic injuries all emerged partly from the harsh laboratory of life aboard ships. The navigation techniques and astronomical knowledge developed by ancient sailors laid the foundation for later advances in science and exploration that would eventually lead to space travel and modern GPS technology. The mathematical and observational skills required for celestial navigation pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and created tools and techniques that had applications far beyond maritime use. As we conclude this journey through the harsh realities of ancient maritime life, we are reminded that progress in human civilization has often come at a tremendous cost in terms of human suffering and sacrifice. The sailors who endured these terrible conditions did so not because they were indifferent to comfort and safety, but because they understood that someone had to push the boundaries of human knowledge and capability, regardless of the personal cost involved. Their courage and determination opened new worlds to human exploration and commerce, laying the foundation for the interconnected global economy that we rely on today. The transformation of maritime conditions from the horrible realities of ancient ships to the relatively comfortable and safe vessels of today represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in improving working conditions and protecting human welfare. This transformation was not automatic or inevitable. It required centuries of struggle, innovation, and gradual recognition that human lives and well-being matter as much as profits and efficiency. The lessons learned from this long history of maritime suffering continue to inform modern approaches to workplace safety, international labor standards, and the design of systems that protect human welfare in challenging environments. The principles established through centuries of maritime experience that adequate food, water, shelter, and medical care are basic human rights rather than luxuries now influence policies and practices in industries far removed from shipping. The technological innovations that emerged from the harsh crucible of ancient maritime life continue to influence modern engineering and design principles. The understanding of structural engineering gained from building ships that could withstand ocean storms, the development of preservation techniques for food and water, and the creation of navigation systems that could guide vessels safely across vast distances all contributed to knowledge that has applications in countless other fields. The human stories that emerge from this history of maritime hardship remind us of the resilience and adaptability that have enabled our species to survive and thrive in even the most challenging environments. The sailors who endured months at sea in conditions that would break many modern people demonstrated qualities of endurance, cooperation, and determination that remain inspirational today. The social and cultural changes that resulted from centuries of maritime trade and exploration created the foundation for our modern interconnected world, where goods, ideas, and people move freely across oceans that once represented insurmountable barriers to human contact. The terrible conditions endured by ancient sailors made possible the global civilization that we now take for granted, connecting distant cultures and creating opportunities for trade, communication, and cultural exchange that have enriched human society immeasurably. The next time you see a modern container ship crossing the horizon, or read about archaeological discoveries from ancient shipwrecks, remember the human stories behind these vessels. The countless individuals who lived, worked, suffered, and sometimes died in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. Their experiences remind us that the progress we take for granted today was earned through generations of struggle and sacrifice by people who were willing to face the unknown despite the terrible conditions they knew awaited them on the endless waters of our world's oceans. And with that sobering thought about the courage and sacrifice of those who came before us, I hope you found this deep dive into maritime history both educational and moving, and I wish you all good night.